Welcome back to the Art Business Podcast channel. Ready for another deep dive with us?
Always.
This time, we're focusing on something crucial for all you visual artists out there.
Mm.
Copyright protection. How can you really make sure your art is protected from, unauthorized changes or even destruction?
Yeah, that's a big one. And actually, we've got a really interesting case to help illustrate this whole thing. Have you heard of Syed Ahmad Jamal?
Malaysian artist.
Yeah, exactly. His story is a perfect example of an artist fighting for his creative vision and winning.
I'm in. Let's hear it.
His case really centers around this idea of moral rights, which goes beyond just the money side of copyright.
Right. So before we get into Jamal's story, maybe we should back up a bit. Could you give us a quick overview of copyright law in Malaysia, like the basics?
Absolutely. So the good news is, in Malaysia, as soon as you create a piece of art, boom, it's automatically protected by copyright.
No need to register or anything.
Nope, it's automatic. Paintings, sculptures, photographs, you name it, it's covered.
That's pretty straightforward. So what exactly does this automatic protection cover?
Okay, so there are two main parts, especially relevant to Syed Ahmad Jamal's case. First, you have economic rights. Basically, this means the artist gets to control how their work is reproduced, distributed, and used commercially. Think like who can make copies, sell prints, use your art in ads, that kind of thing.
So it's about artists being able to, actually make a living from their work.
Exactly. But then there's this other side, which a lot of people don't know about, called moral rights. It's about protecting the artist's connection to the work, even if they don't physically own it anymore. They still have the right to be acknowledged as the creator.
Right, like their name should be on it.
Exactly. And importantly, they can prevent any changes to the work that might damage their reputation.
So if someone buys a painting, they can't just, paint over it or something.
Well, it's more nuanced than that, but you're getting the idea. It's about protecting the artist's vision and ensuring the work isn't distorted or misrepresented. And that's where Syed Ahmad Jamal's story comes in. He created this incredible sculpture, Lunar Peaks, back in '85. It was a public art piece.
Oh, yeah, I think I've seen pictures. Made of those white ceramic tiles, right?
Yes, with a reflecting pool, inspired by the Malaysian landscape.
Very cool.
So it was gifted to the Kuala Lumpur City Hall, DBKL. But then, get this, years later, DBKL decided to renovate it.
Renovate?
Yeah, that's what they called it. But they basically transformed the whole thing, replaced the white tiles with stainless steel, added all this steel tubing around it, even changed the tiles in the reflecting pool.
Wow, that's a lot. Did Jamal know about this?
Nope, no consultation whatsoever.
I can only imagine how he felt. Having your artwork completely changed without even being asked. It's got to feel like a violation.
Oh, he was furious. And rightly so. I mean, these changes totally altered the look and feel of his sculpture. He felt it didn't represent his artistic vision at all and that it was actually hurting his reputation.
So what did he do?
He took DBKL to court, argued they had violated his moral rights, specifically his right of integrity.
Bold move.
And guess what? He won.
No way.
The court awarded him a hefty sum in damages. It was a huge victory for artists' rights in Malaysia. But hold on, the story doesn't end there.
Uh-oh. What else happened?
So fast forward to 2016, EBKL decides to just demolish the sculpture entirely.
Right.
Claimed it was lifeless, an eyesore. Apparently, they had some public complaints.
Lifeless. I mean, it's a sculpture.
Right. The minister in charge basically said urban aesthetics were more important than preserving the art. It was a controversial move.
So not only was Jamal's work drastically altered, but then it was just destroyed.
Yeah.
What about his moral rights in that situation? Was that a violation too?
Okay, so that's where things get a little murky, legally speaking. Malaysian copyright law specifically protects against distortion, mutilation, or other modification.
But not destruction.
Yeah, it's not explicitly mentioned. And that's what makes this case so important. It raises questions about the limits of an artist's moral rights, especially when it comes to their work being destroyed.
Like, if you buy a piece of art, can you just do whatever you want with it, even destroy it?
It's a complex issue. Different countries interpret it differently. In the U.S., for example, even destroying a work can be considered a violation of moral rights.
Interesting. So there's clearly room for debate and maybe even some updates to the law to make it clear.
Definitely.
So DBKL did try to defend their actions, right? They must have had some reasoning for tearing down the sculpture.
Oh, yeah. They claimed they were just responding to public complaints and that the demolition was part of their efforts to, improve the landscape.
So public opinion trumped artistic integrity.
Pretty much. And the art community was not happy. They saw it as disrespect for Jamal's rights and a loss for Malaysia's cultural heritage.
It's a sad ending for such a powerful piece of art. But even though the sculpture is gone, the case itself still has a lot to teach us, right?
Absolutely. It shows that artists do have legal options when their moral rights are violated. And it also highlights the need for more discussion around how to better protect artistic integrity, both in Malaysia and globally.
Totally. So we've touched on a few points about copyright in Malaysia, but maybe it would be helpful to kind of recap those key details for our listeners.
Good idea. Let's make sure everyone's got the basics down.
Okay, so we know copyright protection is automatic in Malaysia. But just to be clear, what kind of creative works are we talking about here? What's covered?
Pretty much anything you can think of. Literary works, music, films, sound recordings, broadcasts. Oh, and of course, visual art. The Malaysian Copyright Act is pretty comprehensive.
So whether you're writing a novel or painting a masterpiece, you're automatically protected.
Exactly. And even though we're focusing on visual art today, because of the Syed Ahmad Jamal case, all these principles apply to any type of creative work.
That's good to know. So filmmakers, musicians, writers, all the same rules apply.
Yep. Knowing your rights is essential no matter what kind of art you make.
Now, we said earlier that copyright usually lasts for the creator's lifetime, plus 50 years. Are there any, exceptions to that rule?
There are a few. For films and sound recordings, it's 50 years from the date they're published, not linked to the creator's life.
Okay, so it can get a little tricky.
It can. If you're not sure, it's always best to check the actual Copyright Act or talk to a lawyer who specializes in this stuff.
Good advice. So let's dig a bit deeper into these rights that copyright gives to creators. We've got those two main categories,
Huh.
economic rights and moral rights. Can you break those down for us, especially for visual artists?
Sure. Economic rights, like we said, give creators control over how their work is, used commercially. So they have the right to reproduce it, make copies, distribute it, rent it out, perform it publicly, even adapt it or translate it.
So basically, they get to decide how their work is used and, importantly, get paid for it.
Yep. They can license their work, sell it, and prevent anyone from using it without their permission. It's all about ensuring they can make a living from their art.
Makes sense. Now, what about moral rights? How do those play out in practice, especially for visual art?
Moral rights are all about protecting the artist's connection to their work, even if they no longer own the physical piece.
Right. So it's not just about the money. It's about respect.
Exactly. It's about protecting their reputation and their artistic vision. For example, there's the right of attribution. This means that whenever the work is displayed, published, used in any way, the artist's name has to be attached to it.
So you can't just take someone's painting, hang it in a gallery, and pretend you made it.
Exactly. And then there's the right of integrity, which was at the heart of the Syed Ahmad Jamal case. This right gives artists the power to object to any distortion, mutilation, or modification of their work that could damage their reputation.
So no adding mustaches to the Mona Lisa.
Pretty much. It's about preserving the work as the artist intended it to be seen.
Okay, I get it. So we have these rights in place. But how does an artist actually prove they own a piece of work? Especially since registration isn't mandatory in Malaysia. What if someone tries to claim your art as their own?
That's a good question. While you don't have to register for copyright to exist, it can be really helpful, especially if there's a dispute. Think of it as an insurance policy.
Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
Exactly. So in Malaysia, you can submit a voluntary notification to MyIPO, the Intellectual Property Corporation of Malaysia. It's not formal registration, but it creates a record of your copyright claim, which can be super useful if you ever need to prove ownership.
Like leaving a paper trail.
Yep. And you can also submit a statutory declaration to MyIPO. This is a more formal document where you swear under oath that you own the copyright.
Okay, so there are options for artists who want to add extra protection. So far, we've been talking about how copyright protects your work from being, directly copied. But what about someone using your ideas, even if they haven't actually copied your artwork? Is there any protection for that?
That's where it gets a little more complicated. Copyright mainly protects the expression of an idea, not the idea itself. So someone can't just copy your painting, but they might be able to create something inspired by your style or concept without infringing on your copyright.
So there's a fine line there. How do you determine where that line is?
It's often decided on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Courts look at the similarities between the works and try to figure out if there's been substantial copying of the expression, not just a shared idea.
So if someone paints a portrait in a similar style to yours, but with a different subject, that might be okay.
It might be. It depends on how closely the second work resembles the expression in your original piece, not just the general concept or style.
That's an important distinction for artists to understand.
Definitely. It's crucial to know what copyright can and cannot protect.
All right, so let's loop back to Syed Ahmad Jamal's case. We talked about how the demolition of his sculpture raised some questions, especially when it comes to moral rights. Do you think that could have been considered a violation?
Well, the Malaysian Copyright Act doesn't specifically say that destroying a work is a violation, but it does protect against modifications that harm the artist's reputation.
And wouldn't you say destroying the whole thing is kind of the ultimate modification?
It's a good point. And a lot of people in the art world felt that it was, at the very least, ethically wrong.
It brings up a big question. Even if someone owns a piece of art, do they have the right to destroy it? Especially if it goes against the artist's wishes.
That's the debate this case sparked. It highlights the tension between ownership and preserving cultural heritage, and it's a conversation we need to keep having.
The demolition also brings up another issue. Public opinion versus artistic value. DBKL justified tearing it down because of public complaints. How much weight should public perception have when it comes to art, especially art that's in a public space?
That's a tough one. Art is subjective. What one person loves, another person might hate. And trying to please everyone is almost impossible.
In this case, it seems like public opinion won out over protecting the art.
Yeah, and that's a concern. Was the artistic value of the work really considered before they made such a drastic decision?
And now, because it's gone, future generations won't even get a chance to see it and decide for themselves.
You're right. It's a loss for everyone.
There's a lot to think about here. And we'll continue our deep dive into copyright, moral rights, and what it all means for visual artists after a quick break.
Stick around. We've got more insights and practical tips coming up.
It's sad, but that conflict between what the public thinks and artistic integrity, it's a problem that pops up way too often, not just in the Syed Ahmad Jamal case. Yeah, it makes you think, if you're an artist creating something for, like, a public space, how do you even approach that? How do you balance your vision with the possibility of someone changing it later or even destroying it?
That's a really important question for artists to be asking themselves, especially if they're working on big public projects. You really have to go in knowing that once it's out there, you might not have full control.
So what can artists actually do to, like, protect themselves and their vision?
Well, first things first, clear contracts are absolutely crucial. When you're commissioned for a public piece, make sure the contract lays out all those what-ifs about changes or removal.
Okay, so contracts are a must-have. What kind of specifics should they include?
You want it to be crystal clear who has the right to approve any changes, what kind of modifications are allowed, and what's the process if someone wants to alter something.
So they can't just decide to repaint your mural or add, like, flashing lights to your sculpture without talking to you.
Nope. The contract sets up a framework for discussion and approval. Ideally, it gives the artist some say in the matter, even veto power over changes that they feel would really mess with their original vision.
What about the possibility of, the artwork being destroyed? Can a contract actually protect against that?
It's definitely trickier, but it's worth trying to put something in the contract that limits or even bans the destruction of the work, maybe specifying conditions under which removal or demolition would be okay.
So if the artwork becomes dangerous or the building it's on is being torn down, there's some wiggle room?
Right, it's not just a matter of taste. It has to be more than someone just not liking it anymore.
The contract's like a safety net, I guess.
Exactly. It outlines a process that respects both the artist and the artwork, even if removal becomes necessary.
So besides the contract, are there other things artists can do to protect their work when it's in the public eye?
Documentation. Take photos, keep sketches, write down your ideas and intentions. If it's digital, make sure you've got those files backed up. Think of it like building a case for your ownership.
So if someone tries to say, hey, that's my work, you've got proof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I know a lot of artists are hesitant to share their work online because they're worried about it being stolen, but there are ways to minimize that risk. Like when you're posting online, use watermarks, low-resolution images, or just show parts of the work instead of the whole thing.
Don't give away all your secrets right away.
Right. Be smart about what you share, especially in the early stages.
Yeah.
What about contracts? Any advice there?
Oh, yeah. Contracts are super important, especially for commissions. Don't be afraid to put it all in writing: who owns the copyright, what rights are being given, how the work can be used, what happens if changes are needed.
Be super specific, and if you're not sure about something, get legal advice. It's way better to be safe than sorry.
It's about protecting yourself and your work right.
Absolutely. And here's another thing I always suggest: join a professional organization for artists. They often have resources, legal help, even contract templates. It's like having backup when you need it.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly. Oh, and one last thing: stay informed. Copyright laws change, so make sure you're keeping up with any updates. Subscribe to newsletters, go to workshops, follow organizations that are fighting for artists' rights. Being in the know is so important.
Be proactive, be informed, and be prepared.
You got it. Protecting your work is an ongoing thing. It's not just a one-time deal.
Now let's talk about a case that really gets into the whole issue of inspiration versus copying. You know, the situation with the Lithuanian artist Ernest Zakharovic and AirAsia.
Ah, yes, the Children on a Bicycle mural in Penang. That one sparked a lot of debate about what's fair game when it comes to using another artist's work.
For those who might not know the story, could you give us a quick rundown?
Sure, so Ernest Zakharovich is a street artist. He created a bunch of murals in Georgetown, Penang back in 2012. One of his most famous ones is called Children on a Bicycle. It's literally two kids riding a bike on a real wall. It's become a huge attraction for tourists and art lovers.
Yeah, it's like an iconic image of Penang. I
Mhm.
feel like everyone's seen a picture of it. So how did AirAsia get involved?
Well, in November of 2024, Zakharovic finds out that AirAsia has used an image of his mural on one of their airplanes, like as the livery,
Wait, so they basically took his artwork and put it on a plane.
pretty much. And Zakharovic was not happy, especially since he hadn't given them permission. He called them out on social media, even tagged AirAsia and their CEO, Tony Fernandez, saying, "We need to talk."
Yeah, it seems like companies using artists' work without permission is happening more and more these days. Especially with social media, it's so easy to just grab an image and use it.
It's a big problem. And in this case, Zakharovic said it wasn't even the first time AirAsia had done this to him. He tried to contact them before about a similar situation, but nothing happened.
So legally, did AirAsia break the law by using his mural on their plane?
It's kind of tricky. Copyright law does say that creators have the right to control how their work is reproduced, displayed, and distributed. So AirAsia using the mural on their plane could fall under those rights.
But what about that whole fair use thing? Don't companies have some leeway to use copyrighted material sometimes?
You're right. There's this concept of fair use or fair dealing. It allows for some limited use of copyrighted material without needing permission from the artist. Things like using it for criticism, commentary, news, teaching, research, that kind of stuff.
So could AirAsia argue that putting the mural on their plane is fair use? Like they're promoting culture or something?
They could try, but whether that would actually fly under Malaysian law is up for debate.
What would a court look at to decide if it's fair use or not?
They'd consider a few things like why they used the work, what kind of work it is, how much of it they used, and whether it affects the artist's ability to profit from their work.
So in this case, AirAsia used the whole mural, not just a piece of it. And they used it on a plane, which is basically a giant ad. That doesn't sound very fair use to me.
Yeah, those are definitely points against them. And the fact that Zakharovic had already contacted them about unauthorized use before could also come into play.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, especially if it ends up in court. But even if AirAsia didn't technically break the law, it still feels iffy to use an artist's work without their okay,
Yeah,
especially when it's so connected to their reputation.
totally. Even if it falls under fair use, it's still ethically questionable. Companies should be asking permission and offering fair compensation when they want to use an artist's work for commercial purposes.
It's about respect, right?
Exactly. It's about recognizing the value that artists bring to the table and treating their work with respect.
And it's about recognizing the power of art. Zakharovic's mural is a symbol of Penang. By putting it on their plane, AirAsia is kind of exploiting that for their own benefit.
You've got a point. It shows how art can become tied to a place's identity and how companies might try to use that for marketing.
It reminds us that art isn't just something nice to look at. It can have real economic and cultural impact, and that deserves to be recognized.
Absolutely. Art has the power to move us, inspire us, challenge us, and even boost tourism, like you said. It's a force to be reckoned with, and the people who create it should have their rights and their contributions acknowledged.
We've covered a lot today, from the basics of copyright in Malaysia to those tricky moral rights and real-world examples of how artists are fighting for their work.
It's been a great discussion. Hopefully our listeners have a better understanding of the legal and ethical sides of copyright and art.
Before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to think about as they keep creating.
I'm all ears.
Imagine if you could add a new rule to the Malaysian Copyright Act, something specifically to protect artistic integrity and prevent situations like the destruction of Syed Ahmad Jamal's sculpture, what would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. It really makes you think about how we could improve our laws to better protect the heart of art.
Exactly. There's no right or wrong answer. We'd love to hear what our listeners come up with. Share your ideas with us on social media.
It's a conversation we need to keep having. How can we make sure that artistic integrity isn't just an idea, but a right that's protected by law?
That's a big question, and one we'll definitely keep exploring. But for now, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into copyright and moral rights.
And to all the artists out there, keep creating, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for the importance of art in all its forms.
We've been talking a lot about the law and everything, but let's get down to brass tacks. What advice would you give to, new artists who are just starting out? How can they protect their work from day one?
It's never too early to start thinking about this stuff. My number one tip: document everything. Keep really good records of your process, from the first sketches to the final piece. Take photos, date everything, and if it's digital, back up those files. It's like creating a paper trail so you can prove it's your work.
So it's not just about stopping someone from copying you. It's also about proving it was yours to begin with.
That's it. I know a lot of artists are scared to share their work online because they're worried about someone stealing it. But there are ways to make it safer, like use watermarks, post low-res images, or even just show snippets instead of the whole thing.
Don't show all your cards at once.
Right. Be smart about what you put out there, especially when you're still working on something.
What about contracts? Any tips there?
Contracts are super important, especially if someone's commissioning you to do a piece. Put everything in writing. Who owns the copyright, what they can do with it, what happens if changes are needed, all that stuff. Be clear, be specific, and if you don't understand something, ask a lawyer.
I think a lot of artists feel intimidated by contracts, all the legal jargon.
I get it, but trust me, it's worth it. It protects you and your art.
Protects your bank account, too.
Exactly. Another thing I always recommend: join a professional organization for artists. They often have resources, legal help, even contract templates you can use.
Safety in numbers, right?
Exactly. Oh, and one last thing. Stay informed. Copyright laws can change, so keep up with the latest developments. Subscribe to newsletters, go to workshops, follow organizations that advocate for artists' rights. Knowledge is power, especially in this field.
Love that. Be proactive, be in the know, and be strategic. Protecting your work is an ongoing process.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, it's not just about protecting your own work, it's also about respecting other artists. Don't steal their ideas, give credit where it's due, get permission when you need to, and help build a culture of respect in the art world.
What a great note to end on. We've learned so much in this deep dive. We started with the basics of copyright in Malaysia, then we got into those fascinating moral rights, and we looked at real-life cases that show the challenges and triumphs of protecting artistic integrity.
It's been a wild ride. We analyzed that landmark Syed Ahmad Jamal case, talked about the controversy around the demolition of his sculpture, and examined the ethical questions raised by AirAsia's use of Ernest Zakarovic's mural.
We really went deep into how art and the law intersect.
And the big takeaway is that copyright isn't just about legal mumbo-jumbo. It's about empowering artists, giving them control over their creations, helping them make a living, and ensuring they leave behind a legacy that truly reflects their vision.
To all our listeners, keep making art, keep learning, and remember, your work is valuable. Protecting it is worth every effort. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Until next time.